Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's episode of Artists in Residences. My name is Kelsey Livingston. I am your host today. In case this is your first show, Artists in Residences is a weekly check-in with both artist members and community artists that we know and love. We started this during the COVID-19 pandemic as a way to reach out to artists who are trying to make it happen, while everything is in lockdown. Since we are now entering into the first couple phases of reopening here in Baton Rouge, our gallery, our physical gallery, which is located in City Park, is now open. Our regular hours are going to be from noon to 6, Tuesday through Sunday. We are closed on Mondays. As a result of us being back open again, which is amazing, we can't wait to have you guys. We are going to change the format of this show just a little bit. Historically, it has been a twice a week check-in with artists of all stripes. We are going to scoot that to once a week. We are still going to have community artists. We are still going to have these deep dive discussions with our regular artist members and still bring you this content. It's just going to be once a week. On the note of reopening, none of this would be possible without our members and donors. So I want to say thank you to them. I also want to say thank you to our partners at Breck for allowing us to have our home in City Park. If you would like to find out more about the gallery, you can check out our website at batonrougegallery.org. Today, I am going to be talking with two artist members of the gallery, Kelly Scott Kelley and Brian Kelley. No relation, they just happen to have the same last name. Both of them have been artist members for a very long time. Brian Kelley has been an artist member since 1996. He is a printmaker primarily. His imagery is really influenced by travel and commuting. I will show you some images of his work once I pull them on. Sometimes it's representational, sometimes it's abstract, but it's always a narrative about a specific space or time or experience that he's had. Brian Kelley right now is a professor at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. Our other guest who's coming on with us today, her name is Kelly Scott Kelley. She's been an artist member with us since 2003. She is a mixed media artist. Most of her 2D and 3D work explore the relationships with humanity and the way that we relate to nature, tech, each other, kind of a lot of things. She likes to blur the boundaries between plant and animal life. We're going to talk about that, and I will show you some of her work. Right now, Kelly Scott Kelley is a professor at the Louisiana State University. So let me stop being a giant talking head and bring on our guests. First, we have Kelly Scott Kelley and Brian. Hi, welcome.
Hi, guys.
Hey.
Thank you for coming on. I really appreciate it. How are you guys doing today?
Doing all right.
Doing okay.
Good. Surviving. Brian, it looks like you're in the big print studio. Can you tell us a little bit about what's happening there?
The campus opened today, so I thought I'd get into the studio and start preparing for the fall semester. And it was kind of nice to get out of the house.
I imagine. We've been stuck up in our house for months now. Kelly, where are you at?
I'm in my house, in my bedroom.
Yeah.
Yeah. Very comfortable.
Yeah, fantastic.
Still staying as much as possible.
Yeah, me too. But our Baton Rouge gallery is open now, so we have our staff there, about half of us at a time. So I still go into the gallery 2 or 3 times a week. But other than that, I am here in the same studio that the audience has gotten very familiar with at this point. I would like to talk to both of you today about the symbolism in each of your work and reoccurring images and characters that one could expect to see in your work in the past, maybe work coming up in the future. Let me go ahead and pull up some of this work that I'd like to talk about so that the audience has some kind of context. Hold on one second. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go through this slideshow of both Brian and Kelly's work, and we can pause on any one of them. We can go back to any one of them. And just as a reminder to the audience, if you would like to comment, I do see your comments in real time, and I can post them on the screen like so. Thank you, Carol. If you have any questions for our guests, please feel free to chime in. We'd like the show to be as interactive as you want it to be. So what we're looking at first here is a couple images from Brian. These are lithographs, is that right?
Correct.
Okay. So I'm gonna scroll back through these in just a second, but this is just to give the audience kind of a feel for the type of work you make. A lot of it has a lot of animal, a lot of texture, lots of overlapping figures in a very shallow space. And then some of the most recent work is a little bit abstract, but it has that same kind of up close, tight feel to it. Then I'm going to ask a little bit about that in a second. Kelly's work here, very different kind of space, but still kind of dreamy, sort of overlapping forms, images. We'll talk about some of these specifics here in just a second. So I think my first question to both of you, and either of you can take this, however, when it comes to making an individual piece of work, do you start with an idea or a character that you want to shape it around, or how do you get going with a piece?
I can start.
Okay.
So usually I spend some time daydreaming, contemplating what's going on in my personal life and the world around me, maybe just stream of consciousness writing, and then ideas that start to emerge that are most important. And then through sketching, taking photographs, looking for images, it's kind of a long process of finding my way to like the image that you're seeing, the images that you're seeing before you. And it's a combination of culling images, getting models to model for me. Sometimes there is a central character that might be present in a few of the works.
Brian, yeah, that was great. Thank you. Brian, how do you tend to get started with your work?
Well, I tend to do a lot of documentation, and whether that's through sketching, photographs, writing down some things in journals. But for me, I sort of go about it in a daily practice. And what I mean by that is I'm pretty regiment, and I'll get up and I'll go in the studio and I'll move around in there a little bit, maybe do a little drawing or just do some cleaning, and just sort of think about things, and then I'll sort of move on to my every sort of go about the day. But I'm always sort of looking around and documenting and thinking about my current state and the environment in which I'm currently in, moving away from or moving towards, and all of those things sort of feed subconsciously at times. And I also do a lot of sort of composing and drawing in my head in terms of coming up with ideas and themes for the next image. So it's sort of an ongoing process for me that just doesn't really shut off. And I sort of carry that state of mind with me in every sort of part of the day, whether it's in the classroom, walking from one class to another studio, or even just walking home, into the door, eating dinner, watching some news, and then eventually getting back to the studio in the evening. So I'm sort of a sponge for a lot of things that are happening around me simultaneously. And when I finally get to the point of starting to work on a stone or a plate, I generally pull the most sort of image that's the most resident for me at that moment. And I start building off of those things, sort of developing a very chaotic space. And the imagery sort of reflects kind of my normal day. I don't have a lot of calmness in my life, and I tend to do a lot of things, and I'm working on a lot of things simultaneously. And it has a lot to do with sort of how I grew up and experiences growing up in a large family and moving from one place to another for school and sort of finding my way. I've always sort of had this sort of chaotic, sort of workaholic sort of state. And
I feel like that kind of shows in your work.
Yeah, I mean, I remember teachers when I was a student always telling me that I didn't really know when to stop, and I think that's true. And I tend to like to cover every bit of paper that exists, and
So
um,
horror vacui a little bit,
right, I know,
Mhm.
which for
but
the non-art history nerds, that just means like a fear of blank space. It's sort
yeah,
of the opposite of how Kelly treats her space around characters.
yeah, but that's just sort of how I've always been, and the work is a reflection of that state of mind and that sort of way of functioning.
So let me ask both of you real quick before we do a deeper dive into individual pieces. Do you carry a sketchbook or a journal around with you day to day? Do you take notes on your phone? How do you collect your thoughts?
For me, it's all of the above. I it might be writing little notes on a napkin if I don't have something around me, or doing a sketch, taking pictures. I liked what Brian was talking about, um, absorbing what's around you all the time. And I think as artists, and we train our students to this, we're trained and we train our students to be experts at observing. And I think that just being trying to be aware of what's around me all the time, and then capturing that through just ruminating on it, but also snapping pictures, doing a little sketch, writing a little note, so that when I'm in the studio, then I have these things I've culled together that I then see what starts to emerge.
Love it, love it. Since I have these two images pulled up, why don't we go ahead and start with Kelly's work a little bit? Some of the things that at least I see reoccurring in your work are attention to the specific surface that you're using. Because what I noticed that it's never on a traditional
Mhm.
piece of rag paper or a normal canvas. Well, normal, you know what I mean, like a common canvas. Your work tends to be on either antique lace, a sewn canvas, or like these two images here, which look like maybe an old assignment of some kind or some
Yeah,
recycled paper. Can you tell me a little bit about the surfaces that you make your work on?
yeah. You might not necessarily know it looking at my work now, but I did start as a printmaker, and surface is always something that we think about a lot, texture and
Yeah, it
surface.
is.
So
Yeah.
it's something that I just love and think about. So even though I move towards more drawing and painting, the surfaces that I use, both in terms of creating rich textures and history. So in these, for example, layers that underneath the images where there's a history, and these layers that create a richness. There's also for me symbolism, going back to the topic today, and metaphor within those surfaces. And so for these in particular, it's mostly papers from my kids' schoolwork growing up, and
Mhm.
Ben is now 23.
I
But
was just gonna say it looks kinda like a Scantron or something in the background.
yeah, so some of these are really kind of collaborating with some. I pulled little images and things from Finn's schoolwork over the years. Having one kid, everything that they touched um, has relevance, importance to me. And
Mhm.
then I created these images, and then I carefully selected which surface. So I made these collage surfaces. I was doing drawings, and then started to match the images with the surfaces, and carefully considered the collage elements that were there and how it would relate to the imagery. These are both from a series called Dominion, and contemplating our relationship to what's happening with AI and new technologies and digital technologies, and how it's bringing into question our humanity.
We have a question that sort of dovetails off of that from the audience here. Um, Robert Sherman wants he acknowledges you using various different materials in your art. He wants to know where you get them. And I will go ahead and pull up another piece of yours to talk about that. These older kind of tea towels, these lacy ones here. Where do you get these materials from?
Yeah, so since 2010, I've been working a lot on these old domestic linens. that were used in the home. Many of them are hand stitched. So it's, first of all, the history of the fabrics. They come resonant with their use and the prior owners and the I'm assuming mostly women that made them. So it's a nod to women's work, traditional women's work. And many of them have been given to me. When I first started working on them, I was working on just old fabrics that I was piecing together, trying to repurpose things instead of using new surfaces. So it's also thinking about ecological concerns with my practice. A friend of mine saw some of those early attempts and said, oh, my grandmother's old linens are falling apart in my attic. I don't know what to do with them, but I can't throw them away. Do you want them? And so then it was this light bulb going off, this aha moment, this idea that the domesticity, as well as, again, the hand embroidered and sewn pieces, and then that they come with these kind of ghosts and history embedded in them. And then I started seeking them out, at thrift stores, but more often than not, people keep coming forward when they see my work and are happy to have something happen with these things that are so meaningful to them. So that's been just opened up something for me that's so incredible. And when they come to me, they're so beautiful. Often people tell me stories about them. And then for me also, these are two examples, these kind of tea towels where they almost have an embedded framing. And so
yeah, they do.
Directly on the wall. And I want people to have a close engagement with them. Though they can be framed if somebody chooses to. I like them to be hung directly on the wall where you can get close to them and really understand the surfaces and what they're like in my studio.
And we have one of your pieces on view right now at the gallery. This piece here, before we switch over to Brian's work, can you tell me a little bit about this piece?
Yeah, so this one is an earlier work from 2009, and this just was right before I started working on the found fabrics, because I had been working on canvas, and it's a little hard to see in the image probably, but this is pieced and stitched together pieces of canvas.
I was just going to say that. This isn't one solid piece of canvas. If you see it in person, there's a couple pieces sewn straight through the surface of it that you can really, this picture doesn't quite do that justice.
So I was already, for a long time been thinking about women's work. My grandmother was a seamstress, and that it's also this idea of suturing together pieces of a story. And I started thinking about, again, how can I repurpose something and not always use new canvas? And this is an example where I was stitching together canvas and I was painting patterns. So then I thought, oh, why don't I use existing fabrics? That's where, and this work was right before I started doing that. And the reason I'm showing this work in the current group Baton Rouge Gallery show, it's called Orphan Twins. My work also often engages with story, mythology, either personal mythology or even this one from the Remus and Romulus story. And the patterning in it, at the time, I was thinking about single cell organisms that are all around us all the time, on us, in us, are both interesting and beautiful microscopic organisms that we're not aware of. They also can be very dangerous. And a couple of weeks ago, one of my collectors who had bought a piece from this series called me and said, oh my God, I'm looking at your piece that I have, and COVID is in it. You must have had some, notion that this was going to happen,
You're psychic.
And, yeah, that you're psychic. And so I
did this collector not quite realize that all coronaviruses are kind of shaped this way?
Right. So it's clear it's coronavirus. It's not specifically COVID, but I thought it could be fun to show that piece because we've been seeing these COVID images on the news and in online. So I thought that was kind of interesting and funny. And I thought this was a nice nod to that.
It's also, again, this picture doesn't do us justice. I really recommend those who are in the Baton Rouge area to please come and see this work in person. The surface is really something else.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that with us, Kelly. Brian, I'm going to ask you a couple of similar questions. I'm going to I want to know specifically with these two works here and this one. We'll go back to the colorful ones here in just a second. I see a lot of recurring specific animals in a lot of previous bodies of work. Your most recent body of work is a little bit different. We'll get to that in a sec. But in this type of work that you've made in the past, I see a lot of airplanes. I see often either like an alligator or a crocodile, maybe, can't quite tell for me. Lots of birds, rabbits, and boars. Can you tell us, is there a specific meaning behind each animal? Are they just fun to draw? Because you say these are about specific experiences and traveling and things like that. Can you kind of dig into the animals?
Yeah, so it's complicated, and
I'm sure it is.
and a lot of things in terms of I've always been interested in narratives ever since I was a child, and my work has always been narrative. And growing up in a very large family, being the youngest, I always sort of looked at those around me as either people or animals. Now, we're all animals, but when I use the term animal, I mean animal instinct.
Okay.
Whether we're angry, whether we're calm, I would always just sort of attribute certain attributes. And I think it was logical because we also grew up with a lot of animals. We had birds, we had mice, rats, reptiles, dogs, cats, you name it, we almost had them all. And so, I found a lot of parallels between, the people around me and, again, the way they acted, and the animals around me. And I found comfort as a child in those animals. And I think that had a real impact on me. And, I used to visit the zoos a lot when I was a kid in Chicago. And it seems like there's always major parts of things and the dynamics of the family happening, and animals are always part of that. One of the great stories I tell my students all the time is my father traded a car for a dog, right? And those are common things that would happen. And my sister married a pig farmer in Illinois, and growing up outside Chicago, that was very surreal for us as a family, and for me traveling to a pig farm. And I've always been interested in how animals are treated, how we treat people, how we treat family members. So for me, there's a lot of sort of interconnection between those things. The work is very chaotic. And that's also connected to a lot of, personal experiences, as well as, stories, stories and books that I've always been interested as a kid. Planes and things like that also are connected to personal experiences, as well as they're metaphors for other things. And the animals, too, are metaphors for things, whether it's anger or it's the way an animal acts, or the habitat in which an animal exists, or even putting different animals together in different sort of combined cramped circumstances also are symbols and metaphors within the work.
Briefly, I'm seeing here, I didn't notice this before until I spent some time looking at this piece. These planes are actually on strings, like marionettes. So in my head, where I thought they were a representation of like an old, human scale airplane, these now feel a little different to me, knowing that they're kind of toys or props.
Yeah. So like when I was a kid, my brothers had this airplane that was made by the Cox Company, where you would put gas in it, right? I mean, you can't even buy this stuff for kids anymore, but back then it was a different day. But you'd put gas in this plane, and you would start it, you get the propeller running, but the planes were attached to strings, right? So the way you flew them was you were stationary while you were spinning in place while this plane was on a string, right? And you would fly it until it just ran out of gas. So, going back to an early childhood memories with planes, it starts there, and the connection with the string to that plane. And my brother's not letting me play with the toy. So we start there with that symbol. Then other things get attached to that symbol. For example, I was in Brazil making a print, and coming on the way back, I was on the plane, and the plane aborted takeoff just right when the plane's about to take off. And after the plane came down, and it was fairly dramatic, the plane ended up sideways on the runway. And I remember the experience of that, realizing that we really can't control anything. You really can't control, moments and times, experiences that we have, they're temporal, and we don't control what comes in. All we can do is sort of experience, take it in, and if we're lucky enough to sort of walk away from an experience, we can use that experience in some capacity. So planes are, the idea of that experience and those things that are attached to that also embody the symbol of the plane for me. I've flown planes, and it was a horrible experience for me. So that emotion is also tied up in the plane. And if you look at the planes, if you know anything about planes and the constructions, the wings are backwards. The planes in my work can't fly. They're always in a state of falling or a state of trying to stay, in a state of, trying not to crash, right? So the strings are also support for things that we experience, right? Those moments that we fail, and how do we pick ourselves back up? Or, how do we help others around us move through difficult times, and we function as a support? So all of those kinds of things feed into the use of the plane in the work. So it's complicated.
Yeah, it is. I love it. What I think is interesting about the work for both of you is they stand alone without someone having to come and explain it to you. But the more time you give it and the more one digs into it, the more you really get out of it, I want to talk very briefly before we end the stream here. The piece on this slide that's on the left with the rabbits, this one here. This one is on view right now at Baton Rouge Gallery. And since people have an opportunity to come and actually see this piece, can you tell us a little bit about what's happening here? I do see other kind of planes here. I see, are these spaceships maybe? There's a lot more punchy color going on. Tell me what we're seeing specifically in that piece.
Well, those are Buck Roger rockets. So as a child, my father, when you're a kid, your parents always read stories to you to go to bed. My father would talk about old time radio and how his parents wouldn't let him listen to the old radio shows, the horror shows and sci-fi shows when he was a kid. And he would have to wait for them to go to bed, and then he would turn on the radio and he'd listen to them and fall asleep to things like, Buck Rogers, Sherlock Holmes, The Whisperer, and things like that. So I've always had an interest in sci-fi. I've always had an interest in, those old radio shows. And in the print that you're asking about, in fact, both prints, I just decided to remove the plane and replace it with these rocket ships that I've always been fascinated with. So, the idea of the airplane and things that feed into that get removed and replaced with a symbol that I associate, my father with, and those stories he would tell me about his childhood. And he had a difficult childhood. He grew up in the Depression in Chicago, and his father was, laid concrete during the WPA, and he didn't have a whole lot. The rebelliousness of my father listening to those old radio shows while his parents were sleeping, right? My father's not that kind of person. He's very prim and proper, but the idea that embodies, he had that little, that little bit of that rebellion in him is really, for me, was always intriguing, and it was sort of a secret. So, the Buck Rogers ships sort of, reference that. I think they're also very playful and they're very mechanical, and they're complex, sort of systems. And just like very similar, the systems that I create within the work, are very complex and dense. Those are the connections that I'm making. And the one on the right has both, right? It has both the rocket ships and the planes. The one on the right I made at Iowa State University right before we left for the COVID-19 closure on campus. I was up there for a week making that print, and it was sort of a combination of a lot of those things I'm talking about, plus some other stuff. And it was more of a playful image for me. And it was actually the playful part of this is that little open spot on the top that's yellow, right? It's the space to escape, which I don't have a lot in my work.
Yeah, but right. Actually, it's kind of funny because you say it's the one little breathing point, but we're, as the viewers, a little bit blocked from that because of all of the strings supporting all of the planes and the rocket ships.
Yes. So,
even our breath space is a little impeded.
Yeah,
right?
It is. And one of the things about Iowa State University, it's one of the most comprehensive design schools in the country, right? So what I decided to do was embrace something I was always told when I was a student, that I have a terrible sense of design. So what I did was that print, I decided to break every basic design rule that existed. So I listed them all out, right? All the elements and principles, and I reflected, and I went out to break every rule possible.
Yeah.
So I felt that I needed to at least have that one spot that was left alone to embrace, one of the languages and one of the elements and principles. But
it's just a little nod, like, yes, I know, everybody, I know. We have a question from YouTube. In Lewis says, these are very unique pieces. These make me feel like I'm in someone's dream. What mediums are used? I'm not, I may have brushed over this very briefly, but Brian, since I have your work up on the screen, can you talk about what medium this is?
Well, my prints are really a combination of every major print process, whether it's lithography, etching, silkscreen, or woodcut. And my work process is to make prints that are segregated into those disciplines. And what I do is, after those prints are made, I scan them into the computer, and using sketches and photographs of locations that I've been to, I call them migrations or paths. They are the driving force for the compositional sort of forces that exist in the work in the end. So those drawings and those photographs determine where things begin, where things get cut off, where portals exist, where windows exist. And once that sort of collage work is done, all that work is printed out on clear transparency films. And then I go into the darkroom and I shoot those onto photolithographic plates. And then I print them. So in the end, they're lithographs, but they embrace a lot of different print processes. And when I was a student, I always wanted to combine the major print processes. The problem was it was very crude back then because you didn't have the technology that we have now. So you had surfaces that were really obvious in terms of, they were very tactile, and you could see different surfaces sort of glued and layered on top of each other.
Well, yeah, because the way that the ink sits on the paper is very different from like a relief print to an etching,
Sure.
Like that's just, it's going to be an entirely different topography to the paper.
Sure. And as a printmaker, I wasn't interested in that surface. What I love about Kelly's work is it embraces that. And for me, that was a surface I still have difficulty embracing. For me, I really enjoy this sort of divergent surfaces coming into a single realm, a temporal space where I can smash all of that together and then output in a single printmaking process. And it provides a strangeness and a weirdness in terms of how that sort of world could be created. It's sort of a metaphor for, the kind of world we exist in. Like, how do we get to where we are today, right?
Absolutely.
We all are sitting here going, oh my God, how did this even happen? Right. But the world around us exists like that, right? It's this temporal space where things are happening that are divergent and convergent, and we have no idea how these things interplay, and then we end up in this space, right?
Absolutely. Well, I want to take a minute to say thank you to both of you for coming on today. I really appreciate it. Your work is amazing. For those that are curious, I'm going to put our website address down here at the bottom where you can see people's work. Kelly, is there anywhere else online where people can find more of your work? I obviously have our website here, batonrougegallery.org.
Yeah, and let me just say thank you, Kelsey. It was great being on with Brian, and I loved hearing more about your work and process, Brian. I see a lot of parallels in the ways that we work, even though they come out looking very different.
Super different, right? But
where our things come from, personal and etc. So my website, kellyscottkelly.com, and also Instagram, kelly.kelly. And it's you have to make sure you spell my first and last name differently. So.
Which down at the bottom of the screen.
Yes.
Everybody.
Yeah.
It's funny because you both have the same last name, but Kelly is spelled 3 different ways on this broadcast. I love it. And just to illustrate that fact, I'll go ahead and pull up Brian's here. Brian, where else can people find your work?
In Lafayette.
Just drive out there.
Yeah. But Baton Rouge Gallery is the best place to go see it. And it was, Kelly, it's been great to see you. I'm glad you're doing well. Good to hear about your work. And I've always been an admirer of your work. So it's an honor for me to be in the same virtual world with you for the last 45 minutes.
Same, Brian. Also, just real quick, you can also see my work in New Orleans at Soren Christensen Gallery.
Oh, yeah. If you want to plug in.
That will plug. Yeah.
Yep. Perfect. Thankful. Love it. All right. Well, thanks to both of you. I'm going to go ahead and let you go for the afternoon. Thank you to our audience. I really appreciate you sending in the comments as we go. We like for these things to be interactive. So keep that coming whenever you see us live. Brian, Kelly, thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. All right, everybody. That does it for today's episode of Artists in Residences. I think this is episode 12 or 13, and I'm finally starting to say it correctly, but it is artists, plural, in residences, also plural. Anyway, we thank you for tuning in. We will see you about this time next week. Take care.